What if I told you the south of the United States is no longer fully aligned with Washington, but with BRICS? Sounds impossible. That's what they said, right before the headlines broke. This isn't fiction. This isn't a drill. For decades, the world order was dominated by one clear pillar, the United States, with its unmatched military, financial muscle, and global influence. But in recent years, the cracks began to show. Inflation, political division, cultural unrest, and a steady decline in dollar supremacy have all contributed to one chilling reality. America is no longer untouchable. And while Washington clings to the illusion of control, something far more seismic has been unfolding behind the scenes. A historic, unprecedented agreement that links the southern states of the US to BRICS. Let that sink in. Texas, Florida, Louisiana, once bastions of American patriotism, are now pivoting economically, strategically, and diplomatically toward a new axis of global power. Why? Because BRICS is no longer just a symbol of emerging economies, it's becoming a counterweight to Western dominance. And the South, it's tired of playing by the rules of a system it no longer trusts, tired of bailing out Wall Street, tired of being told how to manage energy, land, borders, and culture by coastal elites thousands of miles away. Now imagine this. What if Southern governors, backed by powerful corporate interests and driven by popular discontent, began quietly aligning with BRICS nations? What if Chinese and Brazilian diplomats began offering trade agreements, energy contracts, and infrastructure investments directly to regional authorities in the South, bypassing Washington altogether? That's no longer a what if, because that's exactly what just happened. The world was busy watching wars, elections, and celebrity scandals, but in closed-door meetings across Houston, Tallahassee, and Baton Rouge, deals were being made. Discreet, strategic, game-changing. The United States always feared foreign influence inside its borders, but it never imagined entire states would willingly open their doors, not to NATO, not to the UN, but to BRICS. And this wasn't just a political gesture. It was economic rebellion, alternative currency pilot programs, independent energy trade with Brazil, cyber cooperation agreements with Russia, infrastructure financing from China, all initiated in the name of regional resilience, all designed to make the South less dependent on the federal government and more connected to the BRICS world. Think about that. Think about what it means when American soil begins participating in a global power shift that was, until now, limited to the outside world. Now you might be asking, how did we get here? The answer is layered, spanning everything from economic decay and ideological polarization to global trade shifts and the collapse of US foreign credibility. But there's something deeper. This is about identity, control, and revenge. Revenge against a system that promised prosperity but delivered stagnation. A revolt from within, masked as regional cooperation, but engineered as a direct challenge to Washington's grip. The South isn't trying to leave the Union. It's trying to rewrite the rules of the Union itself. But as the ink dries on the most shocking international agreement in recent US history, one question now echoes across the globe. Is this the beginning of a new alliance, or the end of the United States as we know it? This isn't just about politics or economics. It's about the tectonic plates of global power shifting under our feet. For decades, BRICS was viewed as a loose alliance, an acronym with potential but no real punch. That era is over. Today, BRICS is bold, strategic, and expanding right into the heart of a divided America. What we're witnessing is more than a strategic partnership. It's a quiet rebellion, one where governors and business leaders in the South are no longer waiting for permission. They're acting. They're choosing a different future, one that aligns more closely with a multipolar world, where decisions are decentralized and alliances are built on economic self-interest, not Cold War loyalty. And you, yes, you watching this, what do you think? Do you believe the South aligning with BRICS is a betrayal of American unity? Or is it a necessary move towards sovereignty in an unstable system? Let's open this up. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear what you think about this massive shift. If this topic shook your perspective or opened your eyes to something the mainstream isn't covering, hit that like button so this reaches more people. And if you want to stay ahead of these global realignments before they make the news, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. New episodes drop weekly with deep dives you won't get anywhere else. Now let's dive into the first chapter of this geopolitical earthquake, because what happened didn't happen overnight. The secret negotiations no one saw coming. While the media focused on elections, celebrity scandals, and geopolitical conflicts far from home, something extraordinary was unfolding in silence, something that could shift the very center of power within the United States itself. The story begins not in Washington, not even in New York, but in discreet meeting rooms scattered across the South, in Houston, Baton Rouge, Miami, where foreign diplomats, billionaire entrepreneurs, and local officials began discussing something that just a year ago would have seemed like treason: direct cooperation with BRICS nations, bypassing the federal government. It started quietly, invitations sent through private channels, discussions framed around economic revitalization and regional partnerships. But the subtext was undeniable. This was about realignment. Not just trade, but identity. Not just investment, but sovereignty. The players involved knew what was at stake, which is why these talks were held in absolute secrecy. No cameras, no leaks, just strategy. At the center of these discussions were two key promises: protection from economic collapse and freedom from Washington's bureaucracy. Southern states had long felt neglected, used for their resources, criticized for their culture, and sidelined in national decision-making. Now, in the midst of a nationwide crisis of inflation and institutional distrust, they were being offered a lifeline by an alliance that no longer viewed itself as secondary to the West. BRICS wasn't knocking at the door, it was setting the table. Brazil positioned itself as the cultural and linguistic bridge, leveraging its influence in Latin America to soften tensions. China, of course, handled the money, offering proposals for infrastructure investments that rivaled anything Washington had promised in the last 20 years. And Russia, cybersecurity, oil partnerships, and quiet intelligence coordination. India played the neutral connector, reinforcing the image of BRICS as a balanced multipolar group, not an ideological bloc, but a pragmatic coalition. What made these negotiations possible wasn't just desperation, it was timing. With federal institutions paralyzed by political infighting and the dollar weakening on the global stage, these Southern leaders saw a rare window to act, not as rogue secessionists, but as defenders of regional prosperity. In their view, they weren't betraying the country, they were saving their people. The most shocking part, Washington knew, at least parts of it, and they let it happen. Intelligence reports flagged unusual diplomatic movements in southern states. Economic analysts noticed sudden shifts in import-export activity with BRICS-aligned regions. Still, the official response was muted. Some say it was arrogance, assuming the talks would go nowhere. Others believe it was fear. Fear of igniting a civil conflict or revealing just how fragile national unity had become. But this wasn't just about economics. The cultural undertones ran deep. Southern pride, independence, and faith had always clashed with the federal government's increasing centralization. And when foreign partners began respecting those values, offering not just deals but dignity, it was no longer a matter of politics. It was emotional. By the time the agreements were finalized, it was too late to stop them. Trade routes were redirected, tech platforms were secured, currency alternatives were introduced in pilot programs under the guise of experimental sovereignty measures. And the people? Many welcomed it, not because they hated America, but because they no longer recognized the version of America that told them what to think, how to speak, and what future to believe in. This wasn't an invasion. This was an invitation. And for many in the South, it was long overdue. Now I want to hear from you. Do you believe these secret negotiations were justified by the South's growing frustration? Or was this a dangerous step toward division? Comment below with your take. Use the phrase economic sovereignty if you believe the South had the right to explore its own alliances, or write national unity first if you think this was a reckless betrayal. Your opinion matters more than ever in a time like this. Why the southern US became the target. It wasn't random. The BRICS alliance didn't just stumble upon the southern United States as a potential partner. This wasn't a game of darts thrown at a map. It was strategy, calculated, precise, and years in the making. Because if there was a region in the Western Hemisphere primed for transformation, it was the South. The signs were everywhere, if you knew where to look: booming economies, cultural defiance, and an undercurrent of restlessness that had been building for decades. These states weren't just frustrated, they were ready, and BRICS knew it. What makes the southern US so unique in the global chessboard isn't just its rich oil fields or massive port systems, although both are undeniably crucial. It's the mindset, a fiercely independent identity, deeply rooted in tradition, religion, family, and land. This region, stretching from Texas to Florida, isn't easily swayed by federal pressure or political trends echoing from Silicon Valley or Capitol Hill. For BRICS, that mentality wasn't a challenge, it was an opportunity. Where others saw resistance, they saw leverage. Texas alone, if it were a sovereign nation, would rank among the top economies in the world. It produces more crude oil than many OPEC members. Florida, with its tourism-driven GDP and complex port system, serves as a natural gateway to Latin America. Louisiana and Alabama possess strategic locations for logistics and energy infrastructure. These states aren't dependent, they're powerhouses, and when BRICS nations looked for inroads into the Western financial structure, the South stood out as both the crack and the wedge. But it goes deeper than economics. The social fabric of the South has been quietly drifting from mainstream US narratives for years. While the coasts embraced globalism, aggressive environmental policies, and centralized governance, the South held firm on nationalism, state sovereignty, and traditional industries. This divide didn't just alienate southern states. It made them vulnerable to outside influence, especially when that influence arrived not with threats, but with promises. Promises of respect, of partnership, of self-determination. BRICS didn't have to bribe or manipulate, they simply had to listen. They showed up with proposals that aligned with what many southern leaders were already calling for: local control over resources, protection for agriculture and manufacturing, and autonomy from what they viewed as harmful international trade policies imposed by Washington. And while mainstream media painted BRICS as a rival bloc bent on dismantling Western order, in these quiet conversations, it was positioned as an alternative, a cooperative, not a conqueror. What's more, this appeal wasn't limited to state leaders and corporate heads. It trickled into communities. Farmers in Georgia who felt crushed by federal regulations began hearing about agricultural exchange programs with Brazil. Port authorities in Mississippi received feasibility studies, backed by Chinese capital, on expanding shipping routes that would bypass congested West Coast lines. And in local town halls, residents began to wonder aloud, if DC can't deliver prosperity, why not look elsewhere? The psychological shift was gradual but powerful. People stopped asking whether the South should remain a loyal part of a declining empire and started asking how they could adapt for survival, for growth, for their children. What BRICS offered wasn't just money or trade. It was relevance, a seat at the table, an acknowledgement that the South wasn't an outdated, regressive region. It was a sleeping giant that, with the right partners, could redefine the future of the Western Hemisphere. Even cultural elements began to align. Brazilian officials emphasized shared values, family, faith, resistance to cultural homogenization. Russian representatives praised the South's defense of tradition and sovereignty. Chinese investors avoided political discourse altogether, instead offering clean financing and long-term infrastructure commitments, something American corporations, obsessed with short-term profits, rarely provided. It's no wonder the region began responding. People felt seen, not managed, not corrected, just acknowledged. For a population long ridiculed by national media as backward or uneducated, that subtle shift in tone made all the difference. Suddenly, BRICS wasn't just a foreign alliance. It became a symbol of something deeper, a future the South could help build, not just survive in. And so the region transformed from target to actor, from passive recipient of federal aid to active participant in global realignment. Not with loud declarations or flag-waving revolts, but through contracts, memorandums, and private partnerships that now stretch across 4 continents. One by one, Southern institutions began laying down bricks, not metaphorical ones, but literal infrastructure, ports, railways, cyber hubs, and alternative energy facilities, all with BRICS funding, all under the radar. By the time Washington realized the magnitude of the shift, the South wasn't debating whether to pivot. It was already gone. Not in maps or flags, but in mindset, in economy, in spirit. And while federal officials scrambled to reassert influence, many in the region were already asking a much more dangerous question. What if this is just the beginning? That's the question I want to leave with you now. Comment below if you believe this realignment was inevitable. Use the phrase global power pivot if you think BRICS targeted the South strategically, or type Southern resistance lives on if you believe this was a natural reaction to federal overreach. Let's light up the comments. The economic collapse that opened the door. Before the South could even consider aligning with BRICS, something fundamental had to break, and that something was trust in the American economic engine. For generations, the U.S. economy was a source of national pride, a beacon of capitalist strength, a system that, despite its flaws, delivered growth and innovation on a global scale. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. And when the collapse came, it didn't arrive with a dramatic Wall Street crash like in 2008. It came slowly, quietly, in everyday moments. In grocery stores where prices doubled in a year, in small businesses crushed under federal taxes, in banks that closed branches in rural areas while promoting digital currencies that most people didn't trust. The collapse wasn't a single event, it was death by 1,000 cuts. Inflation was the first betrayal. Once dismissed as transitory, it became a permanent feature of American life. Gasoline in Texas soared past $5. Rent in cities like Atlanta began rivaling Los Angeles. The middle class, once the core of American identity, began shrinking rapidly. Families who had always played by the rules found themselves juggling multiple jobs, dipping into savings, watching retirement dreams evaporate. And in the face of this economic pain, federal leaders offered empty speeches, partisan blame games, and vague promises about a new green economy that seemed more theoretical than practical. Meanwhile, BRICS was moving in silence. Currency devaluation hit next, shaking global confidence in the dollar. Nations around the world began dumping U.S. Treasury bonds and accelerating their shift toward alternative reserve currencies. What used to be unthinkable, international oil transactions bypassing the petrodollar, was now becoming normalized. And while Washington accused BRICS of trying to undermine the financial system, Southern state leaders began asking a different question. What if the system is already failing? The tipping point came when several major banks began implementing digital ID-linked banking systems under the guise of security and convenience. But to millions of Americans, especially in the South, this felt like surveillance disguised as progress. Rumors of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, replacing physical cash only deepened suspicion. Suddenly, old fears of federal overreach merged with a very real sense of economic vulnerability. People didn't just want relief, They wanted out. That's when BRICS made its quiet offer. Through discreet diplomatic channels and private business forums, South American and Asian representatives presented an alternative financial architecture. It wasn't just about switching currencies. It was about building parallel systems that offered trade credits backed by real commodities like lithium, copper, and oil. Systems that didn't rely on Wall Street or Federal Reserve policies that ignored southern economies in favor of coastal elites. For the first time in modern history, the South was given a way to engage with the global economy without filtering everything through Washington. And the timing couldn't have been better. As debt ceilings were raised for the 10th time in a decade and inflation continued eroding purchasing power, southern state economies were facing hard decisions. Infrastructure was crumbling, pension funds were running dry, federal assistance came with political strings attached. So when BRICS nations offered investment in transportation, energy, and digital infrastructure without micromanagement, it wasn't hard to say yes. Local banks in states like Texas and Florida began participating in blockchain-based pilots connected to BRICS-aligned clearinghouses. These weren't just tech experiments. They were acts of quiet rebellion. Each transaction represented a step away from centralized control and toward regional independence. What started as economic pragmatism soon became a matter of principle. If Washington wouldn't protect the livelihoods of Southern citizens, someone else would. The psychological shift was unmistakable. Where once there was blind allegiance to federal narratives, now there was curiosity, followed quickly by belief. Town halls began filling with discussions not about Democrats or Republicans, but about currency swaps, resource-backed bonds, and bilateral trade routes. In coffee shops and community centers, words like sovereignty, self-reliance, and de-dollarization began slipping into everyday conversation. Suddenly, global finance wasn't just for economists, it was personal. And while national media tried to downplay the movement, labeling it fringe, dangerous, or even traitorous, the reality on the ground told a different story. Contracts were being signed. Warehouses were being converted into trade hubs. Rural counties were hosting trade delegations from India and Brazil. This wasn't theory, it was execution. And perhaps the most telling shift came from within the business community. Southern entrepreneurs, once deeply embedded in the traditional U.S. financial system, began redirecting capital into BRICS-coordinated initiatives. Agricultural cooperatives secured fertilizer deals with Brazil. Energy firms formed joint ventures with Chinese and Russian stakeholders. Tech startups relocated headquarters from San Francisco to Austin, not for tax reasons, but to operate outside the reach of emerging federal restrictions tied to digital compliance. For many, the message was clear. If America's economy is going to collapse, the South refuses to go down with it. It would rather build something new, something anchored in real resources, mutual respect, and functional sovereignty. Now I want to bring this to you. Do you think the economic collapse was what finally woke the South up? Comment your thoughts below. Use the phrase, "Oh, parallel economy rising China and Brazil, the unexpected power duo behind the plan." While most of the world kept its eyes fixed on Russia or speculated about India's role in global affairs, the real momentum behind the South's quiet pivot to BRICS was coming from two surprising players, China and Brazil. Not the loudest voices in the room, not the most talked about disruptors, but the most effective, coordinated, and, perhaps most crucially, the most culturally strategic. These two nations didn't storm the gates. They studied the terrain, adapted their message, and entered through the front door with a tone that didn't feel like foreign interference, but mutual respect. And that, more than any headline-grabbing sanctions or military drills, is what made their influence stick. It began with Brazil. Often overlooked in geopolitical conversations, Brazil holds something many global powers do not: emotional proximity to the American South. There's a shared legacy rooted in land, agriculture, faith, and cultural pride. When Brazilian representatives came to the South, they didn't come with PowerPoint presentations or stiff demands. They came with empathy. They spoke in terms of shared struggle, of being sidelined by global elites, of resisting the pressure to conform to Western technocratic models that punish the working class and reward speculative capital. It wasn't politics, it was personal. And Brazilians knew how to speak the language of culture. They partnered with universities, sponsored religious events, and even collaborated with Southern musicians and content creators to bridge the emotional gap. They didn't lecture, they listened. They didn't impose, they invited. Suddenly, Brazil wasn't just a South American nation. It was a mirror reflecting the values many in the southern US felt were under attack at home. And once that connection was made, trade deals and investment agreements didn't feel like foreign influence. They felt like partnership. While Brazil built the emotional bridge, China built everything else. With precision and patience, Chinese strategists identified the exact pain points in southern infrastructure: outdated highways, fragile energy grids, inefficient logistics chains, and offered turnkey solutions backed by immediate financing. No bureaucratic delays, no environmental clauses crafted by think tanks in New York, just clear, results-driven proposals that spoke directly to the urgent needs of local industries. For southern states starved for real investment, China's approach was refreshingly simple. What do you need? We'll build it, fast. In Texas, Chinese-funded construction firms began working alongside American contractors on port expansions and freight corridors. In Florida, clean energy initiatives tied to Chinese battery technology entered pilot phases in rural districts. In Georgia, data centers using Chinese fiber optics technology began to emerge under joint tech ventures marketed as sovereign innovation zones. These weren't abstract projects, they were visible, tangible, and impactful. And each new structure, each new job created, chipped away at the narrative that Washington was the only route to prosperity. Of course, critics warned about dependency. They pointed to the risks of foreign debt traps and backdoor surveillance. But the truth on the ground felt different. These deals weren't driven by desperation. They were forged in frustration. Local leaders knew the risks, but they also knew the risk of doing nothing, of waiting another decade for federal infrastructure bills to trickle down while their economies stagnated. In that light, BRICS didn't feel like a gamble. It felt like insurance. And while China and Brazil played different roles, their coordination was subtle and effective. It wasn't about domination. It was about diversification. For every Chinese logistics proposal, there was a Brazilian trade partnership in agriculture or manufacturing. For every energy investment from Beijing, there was a cultural outreach effort from São Paulo. Together, they created a rhythm of engagement that felt less like colonization and more like alignment. And that rhythm began to beat louder in communities that had long been ignored by their own capital. Perhaps the most surprising shift happened in the language used by local officials. Governors and state senators who once railed against globalization began speaking in terms of international partnerships, regional development compacts, and strategic resource alliances. They weren't selling out, they were reframing sovereignty. Instead of rejecting the world, they were choosing which parts of it to let in. And China and Brazil made sure they were at the front of that line. In public speeches, it wasn't uncommon to hear praise for the BRICS ethos or references to post-dollar economics. These weren't foreign terms anymore. They were becoming part of the Southern political vocabulary. The idea that the South could act as a sovereign economic force within a global framework no longer sounded radical. It sounded logical. And while the federal government issued vague warnings and threatened legal action, they couldn't stop it. These were state-level decisions, protected by autonomy, enforced by contracts, and made palatable by the fact that the partners involved weren't seen as ideological enemies but pragmatic allies. Now I want to hear what you think. Has China and Brazil's subtle diplomacy reshaped how we view foreign influence? Drop a comment using strategic partnership over politics if you think this was a smart move. Or say, too close for comfort if you believe the South is playing a dangerous game. Your opinion is shaping the debate. Don't let it go unheard. US. Federal government's reaction. Too little, too late. When the early signs of foreign alignment in the South began to emerge, the response from Washington was less urgency and more disbelief. At first, these growing connections to BRICS were seen as marginal developments, mere outliers in a system that had, for over a century, run through centralized federal power. There was a kind of arrogance in the silence, an assumption that no state within the Union would ever dare to operate as a semi-sovereign actor, especially not in partnership with a bloc that had openly challenged the dominance of the US dollar and the Western-led financial system. That miscalculation cost Washington the narrative and the initiative. As trade representatives from Brazil and China quietly made inroads, and as joint economic councils began forming between BRICS envoys and southern state legislatures, federal authorities watched with suspicion, but not action. Reports from federal intelligence agencies did circulate. Documents flagged unusual patterns of investment, diplomatic exchanges taking place without State Department oversight, and currency experiments being tested under the radar in pilot regions. But the reports stalled. Political infighting consumed most of the energy in DC, and the deeper truth is, no one wanted to believe what was happening. By the time Congress began to debate the implications, southern states had already signed non-binding trade memorandums with multiple BRICS nations. Technically, they weren't treaties. They didn't require federal approval. They were framed as cooperative agreements or regional investment compacts, legally gray, but not outright violations of the Constitution. And in that ambiguity, the South found its leverage. It wasn't until alternative payment systems began gaining traction, backed by BRICS credit instruments and digital wallets disconnected from US regulatory networks, that federal alarm bells truly went off. Suddenly, this wasn't just a foreign relations issue. It was a challenge to the financial core of American sovereignty. Hearings were rushed, investigations launched, and White House press briefings quickly shifted tone from dismissive to defensive, but the clock had already moved forward. The South, feeling increasingly alienated from federal mandates, began responding to DC's outrage with calm defiance. Governors invoked the 10th Amendment. They positioned their decisions not as rebellion, but as preservation, economic protection in a time of national instability. In interviews and public addresses, they pointed to Washington's failures: runaway inflation, decaying infrastructure, toxic partisanship, and the inability to deliver on promises that communities had waited decades to see fulfilled. What emerged next was a war of narratives. Federal agencies painted the BRICS engagement as a security threat, warning that China and Russia were using economic influence to fracture American unity. Southern leaders countered by emphasizing local prosperity and freedom of association. National outlets published editorials on the dangers of foreign encroachment, while Southern media platforms, many now partnered with BRICS-backed media outlets, shared stories of economic recovery, job creation, and rising exports. What truly shook Washington was the public's reaction. Instead of outrage, there was curiosity. Instead of calls for federal crackdown, there was growing sympathy for the Southern argument. A national poll revealed that a significant portion of Americans, especially outside the coastal urban centers, felt more aligned with the idea of localized autonomy than centralized oversight. The BRICS narrative, once dismissed as foreign propaganda, had seeped into the American subconscious as a possible alternative to decline. To reassert control, federal regulators moved fast. Emergency laws were proposed to monitor state-level foreign investments. Agencies like the Treasury and the SEC issued warnings to banks working with BRICS-connected firms. There were even discussions of freezing assets involved in cross-border transactions that hadn't passed through federal clearance, but every move brought consequences. Southern leaders framed these efforts as economic censorship. They used the backlash to galvanize public support, claiming that DC was trying to strangle regions into submission instead of listening to their demands. One particularly explosive moment came when a federal task force raided a data center in Mississippi, suspected of facilitating unauthorized BRICS transactions. The footage went viral. Protesters surrounded state capitals, waving signs that read, "It's our future and let the South choose." The incident, intended as a show of federal authority, backfired spectacularly. It cemented the perception that the government wasn't trying to help, it was trying to control. From that point forward, even moderate voices in the South began shifting their tone. State lawmakers who had previously hesitated to align with foreign economic pacts began voicing support. Business coalitions, especially in energy, agriculture, and tech, threw their weight behind expanded BRICS cooperation. The White House was left in a reactive stance, defending the past, while the South positioned itself as building the future. And now, as the dust begins to settle, the question hanging over Washington is no longer, how did this happen? But what can we still prevent? The South, empowered by economic traction and public backing, is no longer asking for permission. It's setting terms, quietly, strategically, and unapologetically. Now it's your turn to weigh in. Was the federal government simply too late to respond, or too disconnected to understand what was really happening? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Use state-first economics if you believe the South had every right to make these moves, or type DC missed the warning signs if you think this was a preventable crisis. Let's get the debate rolling. How BRICS rebranded itself to attract American states. What made this entire shift not just possible but appealing was something few analysts saw coming. BRICS didn't just expand, it rebranded. It stopped trying to fight the old world and started marketing itself as the architect of the new one. Gone was the image of a rigid block of emerging economies pushing back against Western dominance. In its place came a flexible, modern, and surprisingly seductive alternative to the global order, a new economic language, a new aesthetic, and most importantly, a new narrative. And that narrative wasn't written in Moscow or Beijing. It was shaped in places like São Paulo, Cape Town, and quietly through cultural diplomacy, even in Baton Rouge. The rebranding of BRICS didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, calculated, and intentional. The alliance began crafting its message not for world leaders in the United Nations, but for the everyday citizen, for the small-town mayor, the logistics entrepreneur in Texas, the farmer in Georgia, the tech founder in Tennessee. BRICS wasn't just talking about macroeconomics anymore. It was talking about decentralization, regional empowerment, and financial inclusion. The same buzzwords that had once fueled the crypto movement, the gig economy, and the rise of independent content creators online were now being used to define a geopolitical realignment. The alliance began presenting itself as post-ideological. It wasn't left or right, it wasn't even anti-West, it was post-West, a model built not on opposition but evolution. And for Americans in the South, who had grown tired of being boxed into partisan narratives or ignored altogether by a political center that no longer represented their values or realities, this message struck a chord. BRICS became the blank canvas on which they could project their frustrations, their ambitions, and their version of the future. This new brand wasn't just soft power, it was smart power. Gone were the sterile conference backdrops and outdated logos. In came sleek digital content, bilingual messaging, influencer outreach, and even integration with Southern content creators whose platforms were growing tired of federal censorship and algorithmic manipulation. One particular campaign, launched quietly across streaming platforms, featured testimonials from small business owners in Alabama and Louisiana who had received supply chain support via Brazilian cooperatives and Chinese-backed logistics platforms. They didn't speak like politicians, they spoke like neighbors. BRICS also leaned heavily into technology. They began offering decentralized finance tools, not through state actors, but through regional fintech startups. These platforms weren't branded with flags or slogans. They came with intuitive interfaces, clean design, and promises of economic independence. They mirrored the UX of popular digital banks and crypto wallets. For the average user, the transition felt natural. Many didn't even realize at first that they were interacting with BRICS infrastructure. It simply worked better than what they had before. And while the federal government clung to legacy systems bogged down by bureaucracy, BRICS tech initiatives emphasized speed, clarity, and user control. The phrase opt-in economy began surfacing on message boards and podcasts across the South. People started talking less about national politics and more about parallel systems, sovereign wealth, and decentralized trade. At the same time, cultural alignment played a key role. Instead of presenting itself as a foreign bloc of strange powers, BRICS began highlighting shared values: family, tradition, faith, work ethic. Brazilian diplomats emphasized Christian values and rural strength. Indian envoys shared stories of family-owned enterprises and multi-generational resilience. South Africa leaned into stories of overcoming division and reclaiming national identity. Even Russia tailored its messaging to stress strength, history, and resource self-sufficiency, all narratives that found fertile ground in Southern American consciousness. And when these cultural values were paired with actual results, roads being paved, ports being modernized, internet access expanded into rural zones, the message hit harder. BRICS wasn't promising change, it was delivering it. The optics were powerful. While Washington debated, BRICS deployed. While federal agencies issued memos, BRICS partners showed up with equipment, labor, and blueprints. It wasn't just a shift in alliances, it was a shift in imagination. BRICS didn't just offer infrastructure or trade deals, it offered a story, a new role for the South in a new world, one where they weren't just an appendix of American identity, but a core player in a multipolar future. One where their values weren't tolerated, they were central. As public opinion slowly began to tip, local influencers and community leaders added fuel to the momentum. In sermons, podcast episodes, town halls, and local news spots, phrases like economic independence, multipolar opportunity, and sovereign collaboration began to surface. These weren't just talking points, they were signs of a quiet revolution in thought. BRICS had done what Washington failed to do for decades. It made the South feel seen, and that feeling is dangerous for any power that built itself on being the sole center of gravity. Because once a population starts to believe in the idea of choice, real structural choice, they don't go back. They begin asking new questions. They begin challenging old assumptions. And most importantly, they begin building, not in protest, but in parallel. I want to hear your take on this shift in strategy. Was BRICS smart in rebranding itself this way? Comment below using post-West future if you think this messaging was a genius move, or type decentralized diplomacy wins if you believe this flexible, non-traditional approach is the model for the next global order. Your voice is what makes this conversation real. The borderline future. What happens now? There's a strange tension in the air now, a quiet instability that no one is quite ready to name. On the surface, everything still looks familiar. The American flag still flies over government buildings in the South. Federal highways still run through these states. The Constitution is still the law of the land. But if you step back and watch what's really happening, not through press releases, but through contracts, economic behavior, digital platforms, and diplomatic whispers, you'll start to see the outlines of a future that doesn't quite fit into the old map. We are witnessing a borderline moment where geography hasn't changed, but allegiance has started to shift. And this isn't happening through rebellion, it's happening through routine, through quiet, repeated decisions that slowly rewire power. Look closely, and you'll see entire cities operating under dual frameworks, officially American, but increasingly integrated into a BRICS-coordinated economic and logistical system. From freight corridors to data architecture, from financial infrastructure to academic exchange, the South is no longer just participating in the American system. It's participating in two systems at once. One is the legacy empire, aging, centralized, increasingly inefficient. The other is a rising constellation of regional ties, commodity-backed finance, and decentralized governance. The old world is still in the driver's seat, but the new one is already building the road ahead. That's the real story, not secession, not civil war, but systemic duality. And the more you understand how this duality works, the more you realize just how much leverage the South is now holding. Governors are no longer simply implementing federal policies. They're negotiating. State legislatures are no longer just lobbying D.C. for funds. They're fielding offers from São Paulo, Delhi, and Johannesburg. This isn't just political autonomy, it's strategic autonomy. And it's reshaping the fabric of what it even means to be part of the United States in the 21st century. Consider the way currency is beginning to evolve in these states. While the dollar is still dominant, alternative payment systems are quietly gaining ground. Systems that interact with commodity reserves, blockchain platforms, and BRICS-backed digital assets. In rural banking cooperatives, mobile transactions are being processed through parallel rails that don't rely on US clearinghouses. These are not replacements yet, but they are rehearsals. Proof-of-concept projects that show what financial sovereignty could look like if the day ever comes when the dollar loses its grip. Then there's the question of defense and cybersecurity. While no southern state has formally detached from US national security architecture, there are early signs of self-reliance initiatives being built in partnership with BRICS members. These range from infrastructure hardening to satellite data sharing to regional energy grid protections, all framed as state-level resilience, all moving forward without federal oversight. What happens when those systems become more robust than the national alternatives? What happens when trust in local defense is higher than trust in DC? Culturally, we're also seeing a splintering, subtle but powerful. Education curriculums in several southern states are being revised to emphasize classical values, local history, and economic independence. Cultural exchange programs are increasing, not with Canada or the UK, but with Brazil and India. Public discourse is shifting too. Terms like multipolarity, regionalism, and parallel sovereignty are no longer fringe. They're part of mainstream conversation on local radio, community podcasts, and even in Sunday sermons. The very notion of what American identity means is being rewritten, not erased, but reframed. And perhaps the most underreported piece of this transformation is generational. Younger Southerners, especially those in tech, logistics, energy, and agriculture, are growing up with this dual system as the norm. For them, interacting with BRICS-aligned networks isn't foreign policy, it's daily life. They're launching startups that pitch to Brazilian investors. They're attending hybrid economic forums hosted in Dubai and Houston. They're coding for platforms that bridge American regulation with foreign payment standards. This is the future workforce. And they're already thinking in two currencies, two markets, and two sets of rules. What's coming isn't a clean break or a dramatic declaration. It's a blur, a gray zone where the South remains part of the United States on paper, but increasingly lives in a separate economic and diplomatic reality. What happens when that reality matures, when it scales, when other states watching this experiment unfold decide to try it themselves? We are standing at the edge of a future that doesn't fit old categories. It's not rebellion, it's not loyalty, it's not red or blue, it's something else, something new, a version of sovereignty shaped by globalization, not nationalism, a kind of independence that doesn't need to secede to exist. And for now, it moves quietly, but it is gaining speed. So here's where I turn it over to you. Does this dual system spell the beginning of a new form of governance? Or is it a ticking time bomb waiting to fracture the country from within? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Use the phrase dual state reality if you believe this new model is here to stay. Or type unified or nothing if you think this split will lead to collapse. Your opinion isn't just feedback, it's part of the unfolding narrative. Let it be heard. If you've made it this far, it means this message stirred something in you. And now, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below saying, "I loved the content," and share how this message spoke to your heart. What thoughts did it spark? What questions did it raise? Your voice matters, and your story adds value to this conversation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful and eye-opening video like this one. Your subscription helps us grow and reach more people with content that challenges the narrative and inspires real transformation. Also, make sure to hit the like button if this video impacted you. It's one small action that helps amplify this mission and take it even further. And before you go, take a moment to watch the next video that's already waiting for you on the end screen. It connects directly to what we've just explored, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. May God bless your life abundantly, guide your steps with wisdom, and give you the strength to discern the times we're living in. Stay strong, stay alert, and stay connected. We'll see you in the next one.